Hey there, how you doing, sir?
Doing well. How are you, David?
I'm not too bad. So let's introduce ourselves. I am Pastor David Hamstra here at the Edmonton Central Seventh-day Adventist Church in Alberta, Canada. Also a THD student at Andrews University. And I'm joined here by...
Kevin Burton, and I'm concurrently a PhD candidate in American Religious History, focusing on Millerite and early Seventh-day Adventist history. And also, I am a professor at Southern Adventist University in the History and Political Science Department. Um, yeah, this is my first semester here, so it's good.
Awesome. And so you get to dive right into online teaching your first...
I know, what an odd first year to have COVID-19 happen in my second semester
Yeah, wow.
of teaching.
Okay.
uh, University level. Yeah,
So well done. I'm sure you're handling it as well as anybody.
doing my
Um,
best.
I trust your students are being edified. And that's why we brought you here today, because I think your topic of study has a lot to do with the situation that the church is facing right now. Because we find ourselves living under very similar constraints to those that the early Adventists face, although I think for very different reasons. Let's state
Definitely.
that clearly from the outset.
Definitely different. It was self-imposed in their case and encouraged in our case strongly by
Yeah.
outside forces.
Right. So what we're talking about is a situation where I think we could say that people are forced to worship in smaller settings, right, than what might be the case for much of Christian history. Although I think when the movement starts, right, even going back to the early church, right, you find the earliest church building, is smaller than probably many of the smallest Adventist churches in North America today, right? I mean, you're talking about fitting like the size of a couple families in a little annex to someone's house. I mean, that's our earliest church structure that archaeology has identified. And you and I had a conversation a while back at a restaurant that is near and dear to the hearts of many Andrews students, Baguette de France.
Baguette de France. Yep.
Then I was running some of my dissertation ideas past you, and you were running some of your stuff past me, and just talking about the situations that how our church has changed, really, especially in the 20th century. So what we are experiencing, what we think of as normal church right now, is very, very different in many ways than what the pioneers of the Adventist church would have thought of as normal church. And
Absolutely.
when this situation came and the way we have to react to it now, I drew a lot of inspiration from that particular conversation to say, here's some things that we could do differently, which are different for us, but are, I think, recovering traditions that were lost in our church. So let's go back, maybe start here. Let's go back to the early Advent movement, right? 1860s. We've just discovered the Sabbath and this sort of stuff. What would a Sabbath morning worship service look like for your typical Seventh-day Adventist group of believers?
Okay, can I go back a little before that, like
Absolutely.
1860s when we take the name, but I think it would be
Yeah.
more impactful to go back to the late 1840s.
Okay.
And
Go to the
and
Millwright.
yeah, we'll
Close.
go to the Millerite and Sabbatarian Adventist period because,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, by 1844, you have people that are Adventists keeping the Sabbath for sure in Washington, New Hampshire. You have people that are going to slowly pick up the pace and accept it from then on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Washington, New Hampshire, though, is not exactly typical. Washington, New Hampshire is what we usually call the first Sabbath-keeping Adventist congregation in America. And whether that's true or not, I can't say 100% sure, but that's what we typically say. And they actually had a meeting house, and it's still standing. So we actually know a little bit about what it's like for that group of people.
So let me just stop you right there,
Yeah,
because for many people that term might be unfamiliar. You
yeah,
didn't call it a church building. You called it a
a meeting house.
meeting house.
Yeah, and it's basically the main difference is going to be architectural. And so a meeting house, think about a big box, like a square. No frills, no fancy designs. It's basically just a rectangle or a square of some kind with a roof on it. And so in some cases, like the Washington, New Hampshire church, you actually have two front doors. And according to some historians, the reason why some meeting houses had two front doors is because congregations were often segregated by gender. And so the men would enter one door and women would enter the other door, and they would sit on opposite sides of the meeting house in what you might call pews, but they're very crude. No cushions would have been there. They weren't always in like a bench format. Sometimes they were like in a square format, and you oftentimes had doors as well. And you had to open them, and then you had access to like your own like little cubicle kind of thing.
Yeah.
With seats that set in a rectangle. And so some people would have had their back to the minister in that case. There wasn't really much of a platform. It was probably, in most of these cases, just a step up. And so the platform would have been a few inches off of the normal size floor. And so that's the kind of setting. And in a lot of these cases too, including Washington, New Hampshire, in fact, they actually had to pay for their pews. And so tithing wasn't a thing. Systematic benevolence wasn't a thing even yet. And so pew rents was the main way to finance a lot of these actual meeting houses and churches in both more rural areas like Washington, New Hampshire, as well as in big cities. In big cities like in Boston, you could pay $20,000 for a front row seat, which was, for a year, or more even. And
Wow.
that's their money. This was expensive. And so you actually wanted to have the front row seat. It was a matter of privilege and prestige, etc.
You could hear what was going on probably better.
You could hear what was
No
going
public
on a lot
address.
better without acoustics, without microphone. Yeah, absolutely. And so we actually have some of the record books from Washington, New Hampshire, and apparently they had pew rents as well, which is kind of interesting. And so we actually don't have a full list of members, but we have a full list of paying members. And those who didn't pay, sometimes they were allowed to sit in the back of the church. Sometimes, however, they had to listen in through open windows and sit on the floor. On the grass. And so whenever America is going through its sort of democratizing type of phase, Charles Finney and other people start to go through and start this free church movement where they emphasize that the poorest people should have the same right and privilege to go to church as everyone else. And so the free church movement starts to go through in the 1830s and 40s, and it spreads through places like the Burned Over District in upstate New York, as well as throughout New England, etc. And so it wasn't very long before the Washington, New Hampshire church did away with their pew rents as well. I don't remember exactly when that happened, but nevertheless, the point of all this, though, is that was sort of a unique situation in early Seventh-day Adventism, what we might call Sabbatarian Adventism, since they're not actually referring to themselves by that name yet. Most of the people who were Sabbatarian Adventists did not go to a place like Washington, New Hampshire, where they actually had a dedicated building, a meeting house where they met with regularity. And so that's not the case. Most of the time, it was private homes. In fact, up until the summer of 1852, almost all meetings were held, and I literally do mean almost all were held in private homes. We only know of one case where an Adventist meeting between 1846 or so and 1852 was held in a non-home, outside of a home. But in the summer of 1852, you can really see that all of a sudden Adventists have decided that the door of mercy is not shut. We can go and spread our message wider and far beyond. And so they start to encourage, James White and others start to encourage, go out and preach wherever you can. Yeah. And so they started to use meeting houses. They would often, religious leaders would often let other people borrow the space for a period of time. Schoolhouses were also very common. Sometimes you had other kinds of buildings. In fact, it got pretty pretty free. Sometimes they used, like, I found a case where they used a mill. Sometimes they used a tent in one case in the early 1850s. They sometimes used barns. Sometimes they would just sat underneath the trees in the shade. And occasionally they even met in a non-Adventist home if there were someone that they knew and they were friends and they could do that. They also met in groves of trees as well. And yeah, they sometimes were able to rent like meeting houses, or probably didn't pay for them, but they got to like use them or rent them for free, etc. And so that's sort of the norm. But those type of meetings that I'm describing now, those are not the regular church meetings. Those are meetings when an Adventist evangelist was coming to town.
Exactly.
An Adventist preacher, a traveling brethren, as they were called.
Yeah.
And so if you want to get down to the typical, well, I actually don't know that there was such a thing as a typical service, but we'll say that there was for convenience.
In broad strokes.
In broad strokes, we'll say that there was. And so for a typical, put that in scare quotes, sort of service, it was going to be in a private home. It may not have happened every Sabbath.
Yeah.
Sometimes there was a meeting every other week. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it was every Sabbath. Sometimes it was 2 times a week. Sometimes it was 3 times a week. It depends on where you were. So if you were living in Rochester in the early 1850s, where a lot of Adventists started to congregate and you started to have the paper published in Rochester, they had actually 3 services per week. And they were in 3 different locations, 3 different homes. And they advertised in the Review, the paper that was basically holding everyone together, where those meetings were going to be held. And so you could expect it and you knew what was going to happen. Outside of that, that's if you were lucky. That was if you had regularity like that, even if it was every other week, you lived in a place that had more than one family who were Adventists. If you were by yourself, just a single family, it was up to you. I mean, you had to basically decide if you were going to do something or not. And sometimes it wasn't even a whole family. It was just a couple. Their kids didn't convert, or they were too old and had moved out of the house. And sometimes it was also just one of the spouses, and it was just literally a single individual. And it was very common for people to go months, sometimes years, without ever hearing a sermon by an Adventist minister. I mean, I know of one case where a guy is asking someone, he's a single Adventist, he's asking people to come. He said, I haven't heard an Adventist sermon in 3.5 years.
Wow.
And so it's really fascinating to think about, how do you do church? How do you live out your faith if all of that kind of thing that we're used to is just not there?
Exactly.
You know, the answer, David, was social media.
Social media.
Social media. That's how they did it. Yeah. Of course, they didn't have Facebook. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Zoom or Google Meet or any of these other things that we are using during COVID-19. But they did have paper and pens. And so before James White starts publishing in 1849, 1850, Adventists wrote letters back and forth. Yeah. And a really fascinating letter from Joseph Bates. He writes it to, let's see, who was it? He writes it to Leonard and Elvira Hastings, who were pretty prominent Adventists, very well connected with James and Ellen White, etc. And he writes this letter to them in April 1848. And he says that our letters, this is a quote actually, he says, our letters are common stock. We read them to one another and in the meetings. Yeah. And I mean, think about that. I mean, these are private letters that Adventists are writing just to each other, but they find so much value in what is being shared and expressed in these letters that they actually read them in small group settings, as well as when they're actually meeting in private homes with a larger group of people. And larger probably means 2, 3, 4 families tops, you know.
So common stock here means common property, right?
Common property.
You wrote it to me for me, but I'm considering this now common property because it was such a blessing. I have to share it with others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And this is a fascinating thing because whenever James White starts to publish, he initially does not do anything other than just including like a lecture, a discourse, a sermon, whatever you want to call it. It's a biblical exposition on a topic. Yeah. But fairly quickly, when into the publishing venture, he starts to get all these letters and he realizes this has got a lot of value. Mm-hmm. And he starts to publish letters. And eventually they have an entire section that's just called the letters section. And that was that was everyone's favorite part of the Review and Herald.
Right.
It was their favorite part. Everybody read that section.
It was like the Facebook wall for early Adventists, right? You
It
could
most
put out
definitely
what was
was.
happening in your world there, and people could read it and exchange that. They could do life together remotely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so people consume that. And of course, people oftentimes read the theological stuff, but oftentimes they didn't. They went straight for those letters. But think about this, that whenever James White is publishing the Review and Herald, this becomes the only sort of avenue or way for people to have some sort of uplifting edification of some kind spiritually, for their Adventist faith, their Sabbatarian Adventist faith. They could, of course, read their Bible. They could, of course, read other works on theology, etc. But if they wanted to cultivate their Adventist faith and heritage and the Sabbath, they had to use the Review. And they did. And it's interesting because people actually referred to the Review in many cases as their messenger.
Mm-hmm.
And that word right there doesn't sound that interesting. Perhaps it sounds just innocuous, but you need to understand the context of early Adventists. The word messenger was typically used to refer to the traveling brethren.
Yeah.
And so what they're basically saying when they're calling the Review their welcome messenger is they're basically saying this sheet of paper, this 8 pages, this is our preacher.
It's our pastor.
It's our pastor. They're like personifying basically this paper.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. If you go through and you look at the Review, you can actually read the Review and Herald as a church service. And I'm actually convinced that it was. I mean, it literally was, and almost, weekly and regularly the cases for all these Adventists scattered all over the place.
Yeah.
And so this is how services often could be done, actually, if you didn't have just the Review. So a service in Rochester, New York, where you had 3 services a week, a typical Sabbath service is going to include these various parts. You're going to have the Bible study portion, which sometimes might be a discourse, sometimes it might be a sermon, sometimes might be more inductive. And then you're also going to have a testimony time. And that testimony time, that's where the letter section came in. All of those letters that you see in the Review, and just like what Joseph Bates was talking about before the paper was published, those are basically what people would actually verbally express if they were in a meeting. Mm-hmm. You can see many cases where people will say, we had 200 testimonies in like 20 minutes or something like that or whatever. And it's like, clearly, I'm terrible with math, so I don't know exactly what the math would be, but clearly they're not lasting more than a couple minutes each. Right. And sometimes it's like 30 seconds. And these letters are typically short. Mm-hmm. And they're oftentimes just praising God. They often don't go into a whole lot of detail about like what actually literally is happening. They're often very eclectic or vague, but nevertheless, it's all about praising God and uplifting God. And this is the kind of thing I expect was actually being done and said in a testimony meeting in person, if you weren't actually using the Review. And so imagine a typical service for most Adventists is actually using the Review, and you're getting that through this actual paper, and you're reading it, and you're getting sort of this experience all through the printed text. But it's enabling you to sort of imagine what it's like. And people do talk about this. They talk about how this is like sitting at the throne of God in heaven, and they think about their earthly homes as being sort of a parallel to a heavenly home, and they use the home as a metaphor in that sense. You also have people who are going to talk about how this reading the Review brings them back to meetings that they enjoyed 40 years ago, when they were actually meeting in a meeting house together with people. And so for a more typical Adventist, that means the majority in this case, they're getting their worship through that sort of avenue, all through social media, all in that kind of way. But it mirrors and parallels, I believe, what happened in places like Rochester, where they actually met 3 times a week, and later in Battle Creek, where they met regularly. Because that's the same kind of format that you see being described, et cetera, in diaries and other kinds of accounts. And so that's how I would sort of see it.
Yeah.
And I'd say there's a lot of parallels here with today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people getting their church services delivered via YouTube and so forth. Obviously, when you have it on the printed page, it sort of invests your imagination a little more, right? Than
Yeah.
when you get it delivered to you via video. For that reason, I still like the old radio dramas. It
Yeah, me
somehow
too.
it somehow involves my imagination in a way that makes it vivid, in a way that the screen doesn't do. I like watching movies as well or whatever, but and I think that there's something to do with having it on the printed page and being read aloud that is engaging, in a certain way. But the point is that the word, content of the worship service is being delivered remotely, and a group of believers, probably as small as a family, or as you said, a part of a family, is engaging in an imagined corporate worship service together with those from whom they are far distant. But they see that by this communications media and the grace of God, the unity of the Spirit, we are in fact worshiping together, even though we are apart.
Yeah.
Is that sort of what we're looking at there?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And you mentioned imagined communities. That's exactly what I see it, how I see it. To use a technical scholar, Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities is a very good lens to read this.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think what you're saying about having to imagine more with the text is true. You don't have any sort of visual other than like black and white ink,
Yeah.
and so yeah, you have to sort of create this in your mind. Yeah. So I think you got it.
Yeah, so let's go into this testimony part, because this seems to be the area of Adventist worship that has really been lost, as we move to larger and larger corporate gatherings. I'm sitting in a church here that seats like 300, or we could even do more if we opened up all of the spaces that we had, right? Um, and I came from a church of about, I would say, 120. And during the worship service there, we had a testimony time that took up a good chunk of the service, where people could take the microphone and share what was going on in their lives, and then we would all pray together. But in a gathering of 300, 350, going close to right, is simply not practical to do that, right? Even because in a gathering of this size, you're more liable to have people who will say inappropriate things, during the testimony time, right?
Yeah.
But this seems like it was and of course Russell Burrell and others have written about how this has been a great loss for Adventism, but it seems that this was a really important part of what they did. So I guess the question is, why was that so important to them to read out these short testimonies or speak out these short testimonies? What was going on there?
Well, first of all, everyone should know that they were very intentional about these things. Adventists intentionally chose not to settle pastors in churches until the early 20th century. It started happening more frequently. And there are a few exceptions before that in the 19th century. But for the most part, it was very intentional on their part. And part of the reason is they're wanting to use their ministers to spread the gospel. They wanted to travel around and try to build up new congregations, gain new converts, share the truth. Especially since the end is coming very soon, you need to make good use of your time. But also on the home front, they're very intentional about making sure that people are strengthening each other in their own community, and they're not relying on someone else to be their spiritual mentor or guide too strongly. In other words, they want people to not rely on another person like people often do on a pastor. It's like, oh, I got a question about the Bible. I got a question about theology or my faith. I'll just go ask a pastor. Adventists wanted you to go back to Scripture. Yeah. They wanted you to go to the Bible. They wanted you to talk with your community, wrestle with it. And that they believed that was sort of a way, like going to the gym. That's a way to like build up your spiritual strength and muscles, et cetera, type of thing. And so Ellen White makes it very clear in many of her testimonies about how no one should expect to hear a sermon on the Sabbath. And she gives other testimonies where she says it's okay to occasionally have a discourse on the Sabbath. But it's like, occasionally? What? Okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And she was really against bad sermons, like on the
Yeah,
Sabbath,
well,
right?
that's
Like
true.
she would be like, if this is going to be a bad sermon, just like pull out the Bible and, do a Bible study or something. Like, don't
Absolutely.
have that bad sermon. Don't feel you have to have that bad sermon, right?
She was also against really, really long sermons. However, you need to understand her
Her definition of
her
long.
definition of long, because she would preach well over an hour typically, or over an hour typically, or at least commonly. And it was not uncommon for a sermon to go for a couple hours. And so it seems like about 2 hours was probably about the max, maybe an hour and a half
How
was
our
sort of the
attention
max.
spans have changed.
How our attention spans have changed. At least we think they have. Maybe they haven't, but we hope that, yeah, hopefully they actually were paying attention for all of that time. I don't know. Yeah. And so that's a critically important thing to keep in mind. And so they are intentionally going about this. And so they're wanting people to dive into scripture for themselves. This is why they don't have a church manual as well. And in fact, they decide, they actually print one in the review for people to look over in 1883. It comes up in the GCN session, and they categorically, unanimously reject the thing. They list several reasons. Primarily, in a nutshell, it's because they don't want anyone to rely on anything other than the Bible. Right. And so they don't want anyone to rely on a book like the church manual or a minister who's always there to answer their every beck and call and need. And so, yes, they want people to do this intentionally. And so that doesn't mean that they're not going to have sermons. Someone often may have read a prepared sermon. They oftentimes read the review. The theological treatise, if you want to call it a sermon, they would have read it publicly. I don't know if you call it a sermon or just a lecture or a discourse. I mean, it's not extemporaneous at that point, and you're probably not going to have a lot of emotion there. So, anyways, but so yeah, that is what's going on. Now there are other aspects to this, and I don't know if I'm getting too far afield from your initial question, but there are other aspects to the worship service. We've been talking about thus far, sort of like what might have been a sermon, but then also the testimony time. And I guess I'll get back to that. That was your original question. But then there's another thing I want us to talk about, and that's Sabbath school.
Yes.
But yeah, the testimony time, I think was critically important, because that was a way for everybody to be involved. And so it was actually looked down upon if you didn't share a testimony, and people would talk. Actually, you can see private letters where people are talking, and so didn't feel free to share a testimony. And so people are in the community are now concerned about their spiritual well-being.
Right.
And so that actually helped, that could have a negative aspect if gossip starts to go around and people become a little bit oppressive and oppressing you with kindness kind of thing. Right. But it can also be helpful in the sense that the community now realizes that we need to go help so-and-so because they didn't share a testimony this Sabbath like they typically do. Is God, are they discouraged? What's going on? And then you can hopefully use that as a positive way to sort of help build up that person's life.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of an element that's important to keep in mind as well. Now, you kind of mentioned the space aspect, and a lot of people, like, we should probably mention numbers, because you talked about churches today and how you had a church service where 300 or so people, you said, and they passed a mic around or something like that.
Oh no, sorry. Rather, it was in a church service of about 120 where you can do that.
Okay, right.
In a church where I am currently of 300, it's just logistically impossible to do that all together, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. Well, we have done it. I remember when I was living in Gentry, Arkansas, and we did that every now and then, and there were technically probably several hundred. There were several hundred members, maybe 700 members on the books, but several hundred attended every Sabbath, and we still did it in that big auditorium.
Yeah.
Of course, not everyone spoke, and they didn't have any sort of time limit like was expected in the 19th century, and so sometimes people could go really long, and you're just like,
yeah,
attention span, right?
Yeah.
And so that was an issue, but yeah, the congregations, we should just make that clear. Most of them were not that large. I mean, when you have Rochester, And then later Battle Creek, you have exceptions. Rochester would have had probably a little over 100 people in the early 1850s, maybe. And Battle Creek, I mean, as you start marching to the 1860s and 1870s, you do get into the hundreds. But even still, by 1870, you've only got about 250 members, maybe. It's not until you get to like the 1880s and 1890s where you start to have like closer to 1,000 members in a church, and that was exceptionally rare. Another case, like in the early 1860s, of a large church was like Monterey, Michigan, with something like 90 members. And that was a large congregation, probably the second largest outside of Battle Creek, around 1862, 63, 64, 5 in there. Yeah, and so most of them are probably going to be 3-4 families. So you're talking about maybe 20 people tops. And so it's easier to do a testimony session when everyone's involved, when you do that. And going back to Ellen White, that's another thing that she was pretty intentional on, is she didn't want churches to get too large, probably because she knows what it gets like in her own town in Battle Creek.
Yeah, and she didn't like that so many Adventists had gathered there. I mean, that's pretty clear in her writings. Yeah,
she is very clear on that. That's a perennial thing. She's constantly telling Adventists, "Don't gather here. Don't gather here." Yeah.
So the fire comes, and then we move to Berrien Springs, and we gather there. But
there you go. And then we gather there, or then we gather in Tacoma Park,
right.
or Loma Linda. At that point, you're talking about early 20th century now. So yeah.
Sure. And we have large, I mean, Adventism is just on a different scale now.
Sure.
Than it was back then. So we probably at the end of this conversation need to address a little bit, how do you actually apply historical lessons? Because time moves on, circumstances change, and Ellen White herself in her recorded counsel, talks about how circumstances alter conditions, and we need to apply lessons with common sense. But yet I think we want to dwell for now on some things that we may have lost from the past that are worth recovering. Sure. So let's do Sabbath school then. I mean, I don't know about you, but Sabbath school is my favorite part of Adventist worship today. I just love Sabbath school. I love a great Sabbath school, but I understand that for many people, Sabbath school is where the weird people in the church hold forth with their funny opinion, and it's not very spiritually uplifting. So what's going on with Sabbath school in the early days?
Well, if I can maybe hazard a guess at some of the reasons why Sabbath school can be, at least for me, maybe this is not you, but one of the reasons it can be a little challenging for me is whenever it becomes like a second sermon, or in this case, it would be the first sermon oftentimes, and then you go for your second sermon in the main auditorium. That was not how it went. But I will say by the 1870s, you do have Adventists saying stuff, or at least copying articles from other periodicals saying that Sabbath school should not be a time where you preach. And so it was apparently an issue even in the 19th century. But Sabbath school has an interesting history. It goes back to social media. And so, and I think it's October, don't quote me on the month, but it's definitely 1852. James White is starting to really encourage Adventists in wherever locale they are, if they have more than one family, even if they're just a single family or a large family, and families were often large, to have and form an actual Sabbath school. And it's in 1852 that they start publishing the Youth Instructor, and the Youth Instructor becomes sort of the way Sabbath school is often done. They had a Bible study in there. It was in no way like a sermon or a treatise or a discourse or whatever. It was often inductive with questions, and you have to go to the Bible to answer them, etc. They sometimes put music in there. Of course, they do publish hymn books as well, which we could talk about music. It's another important aspect of worship.
Absolutely.
But they would often have they had letters in those too. They had a letter section. And so there was often the testimony aspect as well going on. But what's really fascinating is that people like George Amidon, he was a printer and a long pioneer from the very beginning. And he was really involved in the Sabbath school. And so he gives lots of advice about how Sabbath school should be done. And what's fascinating is he's living in Rochester, then he's going to Battle Creek. So he's in the big areas. And so what's fascinating, what you see through his advice and so forth, is that even in these big areas, they intentionally were trying to make sure that things were not always done the exact same way, or there wasn't always a sermon. And you do see private correspondence where people are saying, oh, Elder Smith didn't Uriah Smith didn't preach the Sabbath, and they're disappointed, actually, sometimes. And so there wasn't always a sermon even in Battle Creek. But Sabbath school, this really illustrates how they tried to keep it small so that everybody could be involved. And so, David, take a guess. He goes in this advice, and he actually gives advice and recommends how big Sabbath school should be, how many members they should have. So take a guess at what he recommended the average Sabbath school size should be.
Well, based on your question, I'm guessing that it's a lower number than I'm thinking.
Okay.
So today they'll say a small group should be no bigger than 12.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll cut that in third and say 4.
You're right. You're right.
Okay.
You're very, or I should say you're right enough, because he says 3, maybe 4.
Maybe. Oh, okay. Up to maybe 4. Okay.
Up to maybe 4.
It. Yeah.
And so think about what this does, right? All of the students are held accountable, and this was done in a very much more school fashion. So they actually had assignments to do throughout the week, okay, right. and stuff like this. And so it made the students more accountable to do their lessons, but it also meant that you had to have more teachers. And teaching, as we all know, is a way to help learn and reinforce the things that you learn. I mean, they say teachers retain something like 90% of et cetera. And so that's really the best way to learn if you teach. And so whenever you're getting that many people involved, it's really critically important. And they're doing this up until at least the 1890s. And so imagine this. Imagine Battle Creek now in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, where you have several hundred members in that church. If you have something like 500 members, there again, remember my math is terrible. They had, like in the 1870s and 1880s, something like 75 different Sabbath schools in Battle Creek. That's a lot. Yeah. And as a historian, I'm frustrated by this because there's a nagging question of space that I can't answer.
Yeah.
Where did they do this?
How did you do it?
How did they do this? You could not have 75 different discussions going on in a meeting house at the same time. So the only thing that I can suspect that they did is they actually were meeting in their homes. And so they met in private homes, even when they had a meeting house there. And so they would meet in private homes, probably. This is all speculation because I haven't found the answer yet. So they probably in their homes, and then they would come together for a collective service in the meeting house. And of course, this is the atypical, at least for most Adventists, because this is Battle Creek we're talking about. When you're in smaller churches, they might have been able to use a meeting house, but I still suspect they probably used homes before they used a meeting house. And in a lot of places, they never had a meeting house. And so you definitely were in private homes. And so that's how Sabbath school functioned.
So we're talking like 3 meetings a week. Hey, if you have a meeting house, you go there on a Sabbath morning, presumably, to do a worship service and a testimony time.
It usually went into the afternoon as well.
And it would go on.
Long. Yeah, much longer than we're used to now.
Right. Maybe there would be preaching, maybe there wouldn't. There'd probably be singing. I don't think we're going to have time to do music today, unfortunately. That's fine. But I think if I can just speak quickly to that, music back then was much more DIY. And we are really used to getting our music delivered to us in a very professional way. But, I think this shutdown has forced us maybe to go back to a little more of that DIY, although we have YouTube and all these things. The other one would be your Sabbath school meeting, which I guess you would just sort of organize among your class to get together at some point during the week and fulfill your assignments. We don't know how that was done. You've said we lack the evidence. Not everything gets written down in history, unfortunately. Some things are taken so for granted that you don't write them down.
There's no need to say it. Right. I will add one more bureaucratic thing. There was also a superintendent who helped keep all the teachers organized. And so that way they were on the same page. But yeah, keep going.
Then that would have been another meeting for the teachers probably.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sure they probably met regularly.
Yeah. And then would there have been a what we would call like a prayer meeting going on?
That's an interesting thing that you mentioned that. So there were several different types of meetings. Prayer meeting is one that they did do, but let me say this: in a letter that Joseph Bates wrote in 1853, if I'm not mistaken, he talks about how the brethren, and I don't remember where he was when he wrote that letter. He talks about the brethren had decided to hold or appoint a prayer meeting, and he said after that, this is apparently a new thing. And I'm just like, interesting. And I have to also say, I have no idea what it means to have a prayer meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, we think about that as a sort of simple category. Well, it's not. I mean, of course, today prayer meetings are often like business meetings in churches.
Or Bible studies.
Or a Bible study. And so a common refrain I have heard, at least, is people are like, why don't we actually pray in prayer meetings?
Right.
So I don't know how they managed and functioned. Did they actually spend the whole time praying? Was it more like a Bible study? Did they do business stuff at prayer meetings sometimes as well? I don't know. But yes, they did have them. And I don't know how much weight we can put on Joseph Bates's letter, but at least for many Sabbatarian Adventists, the idea of a prayer meeting in 1853 was new. They also had things like free meetings. They called, that's what they called them, free meetings. And I actually don't know what that means either. I can always hazard guesses, but you have to try to figure out and piece together from eclectic sources. And we don't, unfortunately, we don't have enough from the 1840s and 1850s to do this perfect justice as much as we would like, at least. And so it can be challenging. And I actually can't speak to what a free meeting was as far as what it meant. I have ideas, but I'll just not share them.
Let's pass over that. I did something in one of my churches once that I would call a free meeting. You know, I just said, everybody bring some gift that God's given you to share with the group. And it could be a song, it could be a scripture, it could be a testimony, it could be a little devotional thought, whatever, right? And it was a beautiful service. Let me tell you. So I do get the impression from what you're saying that a lot of this was, in a sense, much more of a free meeting than what we do at our church today, right? Like we expect a very particular thing in most churches when you show up on a Sabbath morning as Adventists. And people often pick the church they go to because it consistently delivers that particular thing.
Right.
But we're talking about a situation in which, you know, people are upset that Brother Smith didn't preach, or what, you know, you didn't quite know. Or was it going to be more testimony heavy? Was it going to be more Bible reading heavy, more of a discourse or sermon, you know? And then, of course, all these people meeting in their homes, you know, could basically pull together whatever they could out of the review, out of what people present had to say. You know, you had a hymn books which were being produced, and people could, you know, it was kind of, again, I'll use the expression DIY worship, right? Where it wasn't going to be the same thing every week, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever Jan Loughborough writes what would end up becoming sort of a de facto church manual in the early 20th century, he actually, sorry, my daughter's joining me here. I guess.
Hello, daughter.
There's no way to avoid it.
I'm sorry, Kevin.
No, that's
Beautiful
okay.
Kid.
I think his book was called The Church and Its Organization, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
In 1907 is a year that's coming to my mind. I think that's when he wrote it, and it got continually published into the 1920s. He explicitly states in the question and answer section in that book, like when people ask, how should the order of service be done? And he quotes a bunch of Ellen White's testimonies, and he says, number one, most important, this is a very loose paraphrase, no one should be able to come into church and know what to expect.
Awesome.
And so the point is you keep it fresh. Right. Now, I do wonder how effective that was. I mean, we know humans often get pulled and sucked into just routine. And so I suspect that local congregations did that. But nevertheless, that was the ideal that our church leaders sought, and they wanted. They wanted it to be unexpected, so that you were always having to rely on God more, I guess. You didn't have any sort of pattern that you could go in and sort of like say, this is it. And it wasn't until 1932 when we published the church manual that we actually said, and we did make it optional, but we did say, here are two options for you for orders of service, a longer version and a shorter version. And that was I think probably played a large role, the church manual, in helping create the church that we have to this day. That doesn't mean, of course, people weren't having routine before the church manual was published. I suspect they were.
Yeah, we are creatures of routine, and in ways I think routines are healthy.
Sure. Oh yeah.
We routines are life, but they can also be death when we we are too rigid. So there's a balance there. So maybe we should switch gears here a little bit toward talking about how to apply some of these traditions that we have lost, things that we still do but do differently. And I would just preface this by saying that our practices bear a lot of meanings for us that aren't spoken. And so it's sometimes important to take a critical step back and say, okay, what are these practices actually meaning? And do they carry the meanings that we intend for them to carry? Or do the meanings that they carry make sense within what we claim we want to be proclaiming and teaching as a church? And I suppose as I look at the kind of vision, if we can call it that, a vision for a church that was loosely held by the pioneers of this movement, we can see that they were careful to uphold the authority of Scripture and not of any particular individual, so that there was this kind of democratic impulse going on, right? We must always go back to the Bible. We shouldn't be reliant on a single man or woman even preaching to us, right? We have, of course, this network of people who sustain us in doing these things, but it's at the end of the day has to be structured so that the authority of Scripture is first and foremost. And that, I don't know, did it have downsides? What do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely had downsides. Think about it. Whenever you have ministers traveling all of the time, months and months on end, that's really hard for their families.
Yeah.
And in some cases, families were broken up. You will find some cases where Adventist ministers, their children did not, they just simply didn't carry on in the faith. Some families got broken up, like Joseph Harvey Wagner. His home situation was one of the worst, at least according to Ellen White, and ended up getting divorce and all sorts of things, and the kids had issues, and later one of his sons, E.J. Wagner, ends up falling out in a big kind of way in the early 20th century. He wasn't alone, though. I mean, there were many cases where kids didn't carry on in the faith, and it was hard.
Yeah.
I think another downside, and I'm not actually I don't know if I want to present this as a downside, but the norm even in the 19th century was to have a settled pastor.
Yeah.
Even Methodists, by the time of Seventh-day Adventists, when they're on the scene, most of their churches had settled pastors, even though they had circuit riding preachers before that. And so there's an element of respectability, and I think this has been the allure. Whether or not it's a negative side, I don't know. But you have no one there to sort of like keep everyone in check.
Mm-hmm.
And is that a problem? Well, it can be. Yeah. First of all, there's the desire of respectability, and people often want to look like everyone else. And so you have to intentionally decide to stand out differently. And so there's that. But there's also the side that, like, if a minister isn't present, you do have option and opportunity for things to arise. So take, for example, in 1852, there's a congregation in upstate New York, and it's a bunch of Sabbatarian Adventists, and they're talking about who all's there. And I actually don't know. It's been a little while since I've read the letter, but like the writer of the letter, who we don't know the name of, unfortunately, called the meeting a heterogeneous mass. And what that means, he starts going on a litany, and he says that there were like a couple of spiritualists there, and it's not, I mean, this is before the Rochester knockings and all of that. Actually, no, it's after. Sorry,
But yeah, we're
1852.
still burned
So
over
it,
district. I mean,
yeah,
the
yeah,
burned
no,
over
no,
district has all that
yeah. I
in
got
there.
my dates wrong for a second. Rochester knockings
Yeah,
happened in the 1840s. So yeah,
yeah,
there's a couple of spiritualists there. There's a couple of people who believe that the Jews have to re-inhabit Palestine, and someone had been to Jerusalem that's there. There's a couple of like random, like, they're like, I don't even know what they are. They're like a follower of some individual, sort of like the idea of Millerite. There's some other term of people that I've never heard of, and I know a lot of these groups, and it's like I don't even know what it is. So like, but you've got like about a dozen people there
yeah.
that are not Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbatarian Seventh-day Sabbath keeping Adventists who are there, and because of the nature of their worship, the Sabbatarian Adventists give them time to speak because they give everyone time to speak. And so
Right.
they're sharing their ideas with everybody. And so I don't know if that disrupted permanently that community there, or if it just made the letter writer kind of upset. He's like this heterogeneous mass or whatever, but that's sort of an issue. And see, Adventist congregations, they actually did intentionally call themselves congregational in their style of worship. And that's basically what it was. Every congregation could do what it decided it wanted to do. And so that has a drawback potentially of if there's a really strong leader that rises up with some sort of pet theory or pet theology or whatever, that could sort of really disrupt. And that did happen. And so is it better to do it the way they did back then? I don't know. It's different.
Yeah, it suited the time.
It suited the time. They thought it was better for decades. And so I have to at least grant them that. I don't know if I'm prepared to say that we have to go back to that way. I think that actually would be to go against what they were saying, because they said everyone decides what is best. And so to say today that we have the option to do it differently, and we often do it differently, I think is in spirit of what they were trying to do. However, I personally like the idea of not getting stuck into a dry routine. And so I find inspiration in the idea that like you shouldn't expect to always have a sermon. But I don't personally want to tell someone you have to do it. You can't have a sermon in church,
Right.
or whatever.
Right.
I mean, do what you will, follow God, and have that journey with him, build that relationship, stay close to him, grow stronger. But yeah, if you want a sermon to do that, that's great. And I like sermons,
Seems
anyhow,
to me that Ellen White, one critique that she often had of this, at least as I read it, is that worship became too casual in these small settings. And she's often bringing home a point that we need to be reverent in our worship, right? We need to be reverent. We need to be reverent. And now in our day of, much more formal worship, right? Those statements about the need for reverence and everything have a different ring to them, and can often be used to push us into the other extreme. But I have experienced house church for a number of years, in very small settings, and yeah, there is a temptation to get a little too far on the casual side, to where worship can lose its specialness. Now, in the large setting, the large formal setting, worship can lose that sense of closeness and intimacy and all the beautiful things you have in the home church. But I think it's important for us to interpret some of those statements in their context and apply them to the situations they were intended to address. I don't know if you have any thought on that or not.
Yeah, no, I mean, we certainly need to keep them all in their context, and that's tricky. I mean, Ellen White wrote so much, and things constantly change in history, and so if you really want to do proper justice to that topic, you need to write a book on it. Right. And no one has yet, at least historic. I mean, you mentioned Russell Burrell earlier. He's written several books that deal with this, but more from a ministry perspective, not from a history perspective. And so you need a historian who's able to go in there and actually explain the context and put it together. And that hasn't been done, and that would be a huge benefit. I mean, if no one has done it before then, I would personally enjoy to write a history of the local church, where we can talk about how our church has evolved at the local level, and we can see the development and change over time. I think that'd be fascinating. Is actually these are questions that drove me to the seminary years ago. I guess it's years ago now.
We're
almost a
getting old,
decade.
man.
We're getting old, almost a decade ago now, to begin to study these kinds of questions. And I want to come back to it, but
Yeah.
maybe someone will beat me to it, and I don't mind. That's okay.
Well, I think the annotation project is slowly churning out some quality context giving notes that will, I think, hopefully it will proceed apace and get some wonderful funding, and we'll be able to
Yeah.
have a beautifully annotated volumes of Ellen White's works that shed light on the context to which she was speaking. Of course,
Yeah.
that's a first step. But, for those of us who are here needing to try to figure out what to do here and now, we don't have the luxury of waiting for the historical study to come out. So,
No.
sometimes we can just, make hints and suggestions about, here's the way things might have worked and been applied. We're coming up on the end of our time, but I guess I really want to thank you for coming to do this little talk. I think it's inspiring for those of us living in a moment of otherwise great difficulty, to think that we have right now an opportunity to reconnect with the practices and thereby reconnect with some of the initial spirit, right, that drove the impulse that became the Seventh-day Adventist Church that we know today, and see if some of those ideals aren't worth getting back to. And I have to think that reorganizing our church services in some part is going to take place once this is over. It's not going to be able to look exactly the same after we've experienced church remotely for so long. And my personal call to action would be to evaluate our church practices and see if they're elevating people or elevating the Bible. We have to get through God somewhere, right? He doesn't come to us unmediated. Are we going through people, or are we going through the Word of God, the written Word of God, and thereby finding the living Word of God, Jesus Christ, ministering for us in the heavenly sanctuary? That would be my call to action here. I wonder if you have anything to comment on that, or if you want to issue another call to action or push back on me. What are your closing thoughts?
Well, I draw inspiration from our pioneers in the fact that they had so much value in creating community that wasn't actually physically present. You mentioned the term imagined communities, and what we mean by that is you weren't physically present. They were social distancing, although for different reasons, and yet they found ways to stay close to God and grow in that relationship. And it was a trial. People talk about trials, and they had trials back then because it's hard to not actually be physically present with people. And so that is a challenge, but nevertheless, you can do this. You can go forward. You can grow in your faith. Take opportunities to read your Bible more. I've been doing more reading on Sabbath since I'm staying at home, and I've been thoroughly enjoying it. And I think that is something that we don't always have. So take advantage of this while we have it. I would also say, please do not rise up and protest and say, we're going to meet, regardless of what the officials say. That's just foolishness.
You want to toss in a word about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and how Adventists responded to that? I mean,
in a nutshell, they closed down things, and people weren't protesting as much as they are now. But there were some. But I think it is a bad witness to try to say we're going to trust in God to keep us, safe from this virus or whatever. It's like, please do not tempt God by in this way. I mean, he wants you to use your head, and he wants you to be kind. Yeah. This is what Christianity is. It's about loving other people, and you love other people sometimes by staying away. And this is a time where we do that. I mean, there's all of these different seasons in life, and this is a rare one. We'll probably never experience anything like this again. We hope and pray. But yeah, it's a time to stay away, and that's how you show love to people. And when it's over, resume life as it was before. Get back to people. Don't continue to walk on the other side of the sidewalk. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this is part of our Adventist heritage.
Yeah.
Ellen White talks about the need for quarantines in the ministry of healing. I mean, this
Yep.
is
Sure.
very, the high, and of course, in that is all. She's just commenting on what's in the Bible, right? The laws of
Yeah. Oh
health in the
yeah.
Bible include the need for these kinds of social distancing. Of course, it wasn't practiced exactly the same then as it is now, but we don't practice most of those Old Testament laws exactly the same way then as we do now, right? We've learned stuff, and so.
Right. We don't have the temple.
Yeah, there's the ministry of healing includes this, and we need to practice. I fully agree. So with that, I think we can draw things to a close here. I want to thank you so much for your time, Professor, and wish you God's blessings as you try to connect with your students in the online environment, having that imagined community in the classroom there. Enjoy it while you can, and make the most of it, man. Be safe. God bless.
Same to you, David. You guys have it, I think, a little bit more crazy in Michigan than we do in Tennessee. So stay safe.
All right. God bless, man. Bye-bye.
Same to you. Bye-bye.